it's Lauren. So if you've been watching my videos, you might have heard me talk about neutral spine, or sometimes when we're tucking the pelvis or curling our low back, and you might not have been entirely sure what I was talking about or why these different positions are important. So I wanted to make a little video talking about the differences between tucking your pelvis and neutral spine and why you might want to do one thing in one situation and a different thing in a different situation. So first we're going to talk about what neutral spine is. So neutral spine is the position that you're in when you are anatomically neutral. So if I'm standing up, ideally that means that I have a small amount of curvature in my low back. My upper back is rounded in the opposite direction, and my pelvis is level. My hip bones and my pubic bone are in the same plane, right? So if my hip bones are in front of my pubic bone and my butt is kind of sticking out, my low back is super arched, we call that an anterior pelvic tilt. And if my pubic bone was in front of my hip bones, there I'm going into a tuck, and that's called a posterior pelvic tilt. So ideally in your daily life, most of the time, you should be in a neutral pelvis, a neutral spine. Now, our spine can move in a lot of different ways, and that's why we're able to do all this crazy stuff with our bodies, right? Because we have a lot of movement through our trunk. Our spine can flex, which is this motion. It can extend, which is this motion. We can also twist or rotate and side bend. Now, the reason why those movements are important for this discussion is talking about what muscles make those movements happen. And the answer is your core, right? So all of the muscles that are around your middle are your core. And we often are talking about our abdominal muscles specifically when we're talking about the core, but these muscles on your back that are not necessarily abdominals are still part of it. But we're going to talk a little bit more about abdominal muscles. There's 4 of them, and they're in 3 layers. So your innermost layer is your transversus abdominis, and it starts at your spine, comes all the way around to your belly button, and connects from your ribs all the way down to your pelvis. Now, if you watched my video about hollow body, we talked a little bit about it there. And your transverse abdominis, the muscle fibers run this way. The thing about muscle fibers is that the directions that they go indicates the way that they pull. So the muscle fibers in your transversus go this way, which means they pull in and get tighter. And what they're doing when they get tighter is stabilizing your lumbar spine, connecting your ribs and your pelvis, and helping to unload the weight of gravity. Right? So when we're standing, gravity is pushing down on our heads. And through our center, the only bones that we have are our lumbar spine. And if gravity is pushing directly down onto our lumbar spine without any support, that's a lot of force and pressure on all of the little discs in between our vertebrae. So when our transversus is working, it's helping to unload the weight of gravity. So now instead of it just pushing down on your teeny tiny vertebra, it's pushing down into all of your organs as well. Hopefully that makes sense. So transverse abdominis, super important. Next, we have our internal obliques, which come on our sides from the pelvis up. So muscle fibers go this way. Over our internal obliques are our external obliques. So they start on the ribs a little bit above your internal obliques and reach down to the pelvis this way. So internal obliques go like this, external obliques go like this. When they work together, they are either pulling you into a side bend or pulling you into rotation. And then on the top, we have the rectus, right? So rectus is this big guy. It's the six-pack, right? It starts at the base of your rib cage, goes all the way down to your pubic bone, does this funny little thing where it kind of tucks in at the bottom and actually goes underneath your transversus a little bit. And your rectus does this. It also does this, right? So pulling from the top, it pulls your ribs down, pulling from the bottom, and pulls your pubic bone up. So when your rectus, your internal obliques, and your external obliques all work together, they do this. They pull you into flexion, right? And there's that tuck that we keep talking about. So when you're tucked, you're able to recruit all of your abdominal muscles, right, to pull you in a place where you're really, really connected and engaged, and you can become really stiff. So instead of having this looseness through here that we might have during our daily life, when we tuck and curl, we can become really stiff and fix our lumbar spine into place, connect our ribs and pelvis so that our trunk can't move. We've lost some of the ability to twist or side bend or let the pelvis wiggle. And that can be really, really useful for things like acrobatics, when you're hanging and swinging or flipping through the air, right? The less levers you have flinging around, the more control you're going to have, right? So if I'm trying to flip around backwards, but all my parts are kind of wiggling on their own, I'm not going to have very much control. And if I'm just one stiff thing, then I'm going to have a lot of control. And that's why hollow body is important. But in our daily life, when we're walking around in the world, we don't want to be stiff like that. Our bones are all supposed to move with each other most of the time a little bit. And when I'm walking, for example, my pelvis is supposed to twist like this, right? So it's kind of scooping with every step that I take. And my ribs are supposed to be twisting in opposition. So that's why when we walk, we have this oppositional swing of our arms and legs. The left side of my pelvis is twisting forward while the right side of my rib cage is twisting forward, right? If I'm rigid, then there's no twisting happening and all of a sudden I'm walking around like a robot, which would be kind of entertaining to watch everybody walk around like a robot, but it's not so great for your body, right? So the reason why all of this is important is that when we train abdominal exercises, we're often given the cue to tuck and try to press our low back into the ground, which can help you feel really engaged and connected through your abs, but it's not necessarily functional because you're training yourself to engage by pushing into something, the ground, and when you're standing up, walking around in the world, you don't have a ground to push into with your back, right? So your abdominals need to be able to work without needing something to press onto, right? So when I'm standing here right now, my abs are working a little bit, not a lot. I'm not clenching. I'm not trying to brace for a punch or anything, but there's just a tiny bit of activity helping to keep me upright. And I can do that because I've trained my abdominals to work to support me in daily life without needing to press my back into the ground. Now, if you find that you stand around like this all the time, or like this all the time, maybe they're not firing so well. Maybe there's something in there that needs a little assistance. So, we're going to lay down and we're going to talk about how to feel them work without needing to press your low back into the ground. We're just going to do a couple of simple things here, and then you can apply this to any abdominal exercises that you do ever. So first I'm going to find neutral. And as we said before, when you're standing up, neutral is hip bones and pubic bone on the same plane. When you're laying down, Neutral is hip bones and pubic bone level with each other. So you can rock back and forth and try to find that position where you feel like your pelvic bowl is level with the floor instead of it pouring towards your upper body or spilling between your legs. And then I'm going to try to engage my transversus. So a couple different ways that you can think about this. I'm going to take my 2 fingers, I'm going to find my hip bones, and then I'm going to walk them in just a little bit so I find meat. And I'm going to give myself just a little bit of gentle pressure there. I'm going to take a deep breath. And as I exhale, I'm going to imagine trying to draw my hip bones towards each other across the front of my body. Now, as I did that, I felt some muscles activate under my fingers. Inhale and relax. And exhale and do the same thing. Now, if that's not quite clicking for you, you could also think about trying to pull your skin away from your shirt. So if you were wearing a wet t-shirt, as you exhale, you're trying to draw in so that you don't touch your shirt anymore because it's cold. And hopefully as you do this, you're feeling the sensation of wrapping in and some activation. That's your transversus. Now, things to pay attention to are, do you automatically want to tuck and press your low back down when you're thinking about making that connection? Now, that would be an indication that you have trained yourself really, really well that engagement happens in a tuck and not necessarily in neutral. So if you're finding yourself pressing down into the ground, or if you're not sure whether or not you're doing that, you can take your hands, fingers all together, and stick them at your low back just above the top of your pelvis. So when we're neutral, laying on the ground, there should be maybe a little bit of space between your low back and the mat, or your back might just gently touch the mat without having a lot of pressure. But you should be able to stick some fingers underneath there, and you're going to feel for whether or not, as you engage, you are pressing down into your hands. And you're trying to keep the pressure on your hands steady as you exhale, and think about either hip bones drawing together, pulling your shirt away, or your skin away from your shirt, whatever it is that seemed to make some sense for you. So that is your neutral pelvis with transversus engagement. Now, to challenge it, to see if you can hold this, you can add in a little gentle leg movement. You can pick up one leg and set it all the way down before you pick up the other leg. And to make it harder, you can switch your feet at the same time. And to make it all, like the hardest way to do it would be to tap from your knees up. Can you keep that same amount of tension through your center? Keep the same amount of pressure through your hands on your back the whole time that your legs are moving? So now sometimes when we're doing abdominal work on the floor, our back is going to press into the ground. And it's doing that because it has to. So when we go up into flexion, like if I was going to do a curl up, I'm going to take my hands behind my head. We might often start a curl up by curling our pelvis while we lift our head up. But that's training our abdominals to pull together from both ends at the same time. And in our daily life, that's maybe not a functional movement. Or if you're an aerialist, maybe you're trying to go upside down, and that means you need to be able to pull your abdominals just from the top to the bottom, or just from the bottom to the top. If we're standing up and leaning over, we want to be able to pull from the top down rather than trying to pull ourselves together. So when we do our curl up, we're going to try to keep our pelvis neutral. So here I'm thinking about my tailbone being connected to the mat. I'm taking my hands behind my head, and then I'm going to leave my tailbone connected to the mat while I tuck my chin and lift my head and shoulders. Now, right about here, I feel my back come in contact with the ground. And that is because my head got high enough, pulling me into enough flexion that my low back connected to the mat, not because I curled my pelvis while I was lifting my head up. I go up higher when I keep my spine neutral than I do if I'm curling from both sides, and it's a lot harder. So we'll do a couple more. You can exhale as you curl. And really pay attention to where this movement is coming from. The other thing to pay attention to is whether or not your feet are pushing into the ground. If your feet are pushing into the ground, you're probably curling your pelvis, and they're actually making it a little easier for you. Whereas if you keep your feet light on the floor, it's much harder to curl while you do this. So where we see a practical application of this curl up and having our back flat into the ground is if we were doing hollow body. So if I curl up, I tuck my knees into my chest and then extend my legs. Here, I do want to be tucked. I do want to think about pressing my back down into the mat, drawing my ribs and hips together, taking my arms wherever I want them to be for the purpose of my drill, and then I can come all the way out. So in that instance, where we do want to be a little bit tucked, and our low back is connected into the ground, I can think about finding more engagement by pressing down, because that is going to help me activate my transversus, which needs to be really strong in that position. But it's not necessarily what I want to do every time I'm training my abs laying on the floor. So play with your neutral spine. Can you tap your toes? Can you move your arms? Go back and do a Pilates video that I shared thinking about that. Does it make it harder? Does it make it different? Let me know if you have any questions. I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you next time. Bye.